I'm Tony Wierzbicki. I'm Professor of Cardiometabolic Disease at Guy's and Thomas's Hospitals in London and also at King's College London. I'm here to discuss today where we stand before the trials are presented at the American College of Cardiology, and in particular the first endpoints trial with the PCSK9 inhibitor evolocumab. We have a long history of drugs that lower LDL cholesterol. It started in the mid-90s with a moderate dose of a statin, simvastatin 20 milligrams in the Fourier study, that settled the lipid controversy. In effect, reducing LDL cholesterol did reduce cardiac events, it did reduce strokes, and it also reduced death. We then went on from the days of moderate dose statins in secondary prevention to proving it in primary prevention with the West of Scotland study, and then using higher and higher doses of statins in such studies as TNT and IDEAL, where the new paradigm of the highest dose of statin that you could tolerate was established. And these have actually been reasonably successful, and there are people out there that think that actually this is all we need to do. The point of the new drugs is they lower LDL cholesterol further. Is this going to give us any benefit? And I think that's the big question. Ezetimibe was launched about 10 to 15 years ago in many markets with a lot of publicity, but then the initial studies using the surrogate outcome of carotid IMT were disappointing. There was very little difference, and everyone questioned whether a non-statin mechanism of lowering LDL cholesterol was effective. We only got the answers to that very recently when we had the Improve It studies, data to which I will return later on. With PCSK9s, we have a novel therapy that lowers LDL as much or more than even the most powerful statin. The mechanism of action is through effectively upregulating the LDL receptor expression, so in effect rather similar to statins in that regard. And we are very lucky that in the case of evolocumab we have announced at the American Heart Association the data from an intravascular ultrasound study that looked at the drug. In the Glagov study, evolocumab was compared on baseline statin therapy in patients with 50% coronary artery stenosis, the typical population used for IVUS studies. And the interesting thing in the Glagov study was that you actually got further reductions in percentage atheroma volume, the IVUS detectable atheroma burden within the coronary arteries. This data has now been published, but the interesting thing about it is the wide range that you see with it. While the line for the study and on treatment for the individual patients actually shows a progressive decrease across LDL values, the point of stabilization is about 90 milligrams per deciliter. So it's about 2.2 millimoles per litre. On the other hand, to actually get the 95th centile of the upper limit to cross the stabilization threshold, you have to get down to 60 milligrams per deciliter, or 1.5 millimoles per litre. And this is a challenge. We will not get there with statins. Most statins will get people somewhere near an LDL cholesterol of 2 or 80 milligrams per deciliter, but not much beyond. What has happened in the Fourier trial, which is the trial that is going to be announced at the American College of Cardiology in March in Washington, is the results of lowering that further. The Fourier is a pretty standard design, so it's a secondary prevention trial recruiting predominantly people with established myocardial infarction, about 80%, another 20% approximately with stroke, and also disease in other beds, because 13% have peripheral arterial disease. They have other risk factors. 80% have hypertension, about a third have diabetes, and about almost 30% smoke, quite a high proportion for current trials. Usually it's about 20%. So this is a high risk population within the stable coronary disease group, where what they're being treated with is actually what we know to be the reality of statin treatment these days. that 2/3 of them are on a high potency, high dose statin, and about 25% are on a moderate efficacy statin. This data has been just recently reproduced from a large survey of the UK national GP databases where similar results have been found. So it's typical. We have a very low percentage on ezetimibe, 5%. So it's a baseline statin treated, high risk, stable coronary disease population. We know the baseline LDL going in, it's about 2.3 millimoles per litre. And we would expect, based on the other studies done with the drug, that that will be reduced by about 50 to 55%. So somewhere around the 1.2 millimole mark is likely to be the outcome. We also know, as a result of stock market announcements, that Fourier has met its primary endpoint. From the design paper, which has been published in the American Heart Journal, we know that that is a 15% reduction in a combined primary endpoint of fatal and non-fatal cardiovascular events, acute cardiac hospitalizations, and percutaneous interventions. Also in that stock market announcement was that it had met a secondary endpoint, which was hard events, that is fatal and non-fatal stroke and coronary heart disease. We do not know the percentage as yet. So it looks very promising. It looks like another novel therapy. We have statins, we have ezetimibe. Now PCSK9s have demonstrated that lowering LDL further reduces cardiovascular events. It doesn't seem to be the modality of lowering LDL that matters, it's lowering the LDL cholesterol.